Hi again then guys, and welcome to the 90th episode of B-Road Ballers, now discussing a vehicle which we have had in another series in the past, the Dark series, which for those who are unfamiliar is a series discussing vehicles which are underappreciated, undervalued, sometimes sleeper cars as well, but cars which deserve to have more recognition than they do have, compared to how good they actually are. Now this is definitely one of those cars. There are certain people who do know how good it is, and those people who do like it tend to use it a fair bit, but it doesn't have the kind of exposure as some of the very, very popular, say, seasonal event vehicles like your Dome Zero, your Mazda RX-500, your Suzuki GSX R4, and others in that similar vein. This one, though, is a brilliant performance car, although not necessarily quite as quick as those, but good in different ways, and the vehicle is the Citroen C3. It's definitely a sleeper car. It's about as much of a sleeper car as you can really get. It's a small, front-engine, front-wheel drive city runabout. It's not even really a sports model, all things considered, certainly not what you'd call a hot hatch, but the kind of potential that this car has, especially of course with tuning, is very good. In fact, it can give cars with a lot more power, hatchbacks or otherwise, a great run for their money. Now the engine is a 1.6 litre, you can turbocharge it, thankfully, up to 307 horsepower. That's pretty good, especially for a car of its size and type, being that it's not a full-size hatch, it's more of a super mini. And typically you'd expect a hatch like this to probably have somewhere between 240 and maybe 270 horsepower fully tuned. So 307 is pretty good, to say the least. The torque is also very good at 237 pound-feet, and as you'd expect, it is quite lightweight as well. 893 kilos isn't ridiculously light, but that is at the same time lighter than, for instance, a Le Mans prototype, or the majority of LMP cars at least. Now the PP level on this car is very good. It could easily be too high, as some other hatchbacks are and some other vehicles in general are, especially given the potential that this car has and the ability which it has. But the PP level, even with all of the upgrades fitted, is only 479. That's really good. You can easily down-tune this car to 475, or rather just not fit everything to it. And considering that it's only an 18 grand car, that's really good value, at least on paper. The question is though, can it translate that into actual performance? Because of course we have discussed other vehicles, both in this series and in other ones, which have great numbers, but don't necessarily deliver on it. Stuff like the Toyota Will, that's a perfect example. That is a car with great numbers on paper, surprisingly good in some ways, but due to the fact that it's not a full-on performance car, it struggles sometimes to turn those great numbers into performance, which would typically be associated with a hatchback with those kind of numbers. Because it's not a hot hatch to begin with, it sometimes struggles. So does that happen with this car, or does it overcome that? Well, it definitely does. And there are a couple of these underwhelming sleeper spec hatches which do that. The Vauxhall Corsa is another great example. I'm personally not a huge fan of that car, I prefer the Citroen, but it is similar in the way that it's very easy to underestimate, very cheap. It's a car which people don't really take any notice of, but it has a small, dedicated following of people who actually realise just how good the car can be. And this really is a perfect example of that. Now, if you're looking purely at numbers, it may not have the most remarkable acceleration times over the quarter mile or the most insane top-end speed, but what it does have is incredible cornering speed ability. Not necessarily just handling either, because you could have a car which seems to have very good handling, but it may just have good handling because it's slow, whereas if that car had a lot more power, it might suddenly become very, very bad. Then on the opposite end of that same spectrum, you've got cars which can corner extremely quickly, but they're not necessarily as easy to drive or as beginner friendly. Something like a TVR, for instance, or a Cobra or a Stratos. They are typically cars which can take corners very quickly because they're so manoeuvrable, but that same manoeuvrability makes them twitchy, slippery, and not friendly to people who aren't experienced with cars of that kind of performance. The Citroen is really good because it manages to get the best of both worlds. It has the kind of cornering speed which you'd want from a small lightweight hatch, but at the same time it's very easy to use the car at those speeds. The car doesn't bite back, it's not difficult to drive, it's so small and compact, almost like a ball with wheels, that you can really throw it through corners. And although there is a little bit of understeer present sometimes, especially on very, very tight corners, given that it does have over 300 horsepower, that's not bad. For a car that's not a full-on performance model, to handle as well as this one does, with that amount of power and torque, is very impressive. So overall, it's a fairly simple review, and of course we did cover the car before, but just not with the full range of specs that we have now. But the one thing that remains is that I would definitely recommend checking out the Citroen C3 if you do get the chance, and if you feel so inclined. It's not a car which you'd necessarily want to drive just for the fun of it, although some people might. Not for me personally though. On the other hand, it's one of those cars which does have a place, and that place is as a track weapon. It's an excellent PP specific racer, be it 475, 450, whatever. And for that, it's very, very good. And as far as small hatchbacks go, there are actually relatively few of a similar size and price which can genuinely take on the Citroen C3 for sheer ability. One of the relatively few that can is the Volkswagen Polo GTI, which is also a superb example of a super mini style hot hatch, those much smaller, lower powered hatches which are actually still really fast. But that's it overall for this particular episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.